Wonderful. I'm Kate Trans, and today we are welcoming Dr. Dan Foster to share Reflections of a Buffalo Dreamer, Psychologist on a Northern Plains Indigenous Healing Program. I want to welcome you as a part of the National American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We are part of the MHTTC network, which also includes 10 regional centers, a network coordinating office, and the National Hispanic and Latino MHTTC. This project is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, and the content is developed by the presenter, and the opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the American Indian and Alaska Native MHTTC. In the next couple of days, we will send out a follow-up email to everyone who attended, which will include a link to the recording and a CEU request form. Our center is a NADAC certified educational provider, and we'd be happy to provide you with CEUs for a $15 fee. We also have a short evaluation or survey that we would love to have you fill out and let us know what you thought of today's presentation. This feedback is critical to our future work, and we value your opinion and would really appreciate you sharing your time and thoughts with us. And just so you know, we will have the participants muted for the duration of this webinar. Like I said, we have the webcam option available if you wanted to share your lovely faces with us. We'd love to see your face, and you can do so by, you can see up in the camera pod, there should be a start button up there, and after you press that, you'll have to click share again. And that way we can get some good visual feedback, and you can also type in questions and comments into the chat box right below that. And in just a moment, I'll make that a little bit bigger so we can see faces a little better. But I want to welcome Dr. Dan Foster. I'm so excited to have him present for us today. He has really great experience to share, from having served as an Army sergeant, to having been the National Director of the Bureau of Prisons Drug Abuse Programs, overseeing drug treatment, behavioral health, forensic, and psychiatric inpatient programs. He also is a national, collegiate, and international athlete, and has been at Olympics before, so he's got some great stories having been to the Olympics, serving our country. And so I also wanted to share too that he and his wife, who is a PhD in psychology and also an American Indian, have adopted numerous children, including special needs children, and they've contributed to the development of the American Indian graduate education in clinical psychology. They have been advocates, research consultants, and educators as well, and they live a traditional and ceremonial life in contemporary times. So I'm gonna close out this box here, and Dr. Foster is going to teach in a little bit more traditional manner today and not have PowerPoint. So I think this will be a great opportunity for us to see each other's faces and to listen. And so I want to welcome Dr. Foster at this time, and I'll pass things over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kate. Good to see some friends on board, and some longtime friends too. I chose to not use PowerPoint, and sometimes all my years with Bureau of Prisons, I found out later, sometimes I felt terribly alone, because I worked in a world where they had shitheads, and I'm still not sure what a shithead is. I assume they meant inmates. And so I only worked with human beings. And so I've had a long career working with human beings, and have been deeply blessed. And I hope I've also been a blessing to the men and women that I've been privileged to serve, not just within the confines of correctional facilities, but Indian Health and all the various capacities that my wife and I have had the privilege of serving. Something that was of difficulty for me even back when I was taking classes, is I assumed at the outset of becoming a clinical psychologist back in the 70s um, that I would have quite a repertoire as a scientist to understand the mystery and the functioning of human beings broadly. I was intrigued even when I was doing my original studies that sociology appeared to me to be a more appropriate setting for most interventions that we would do on a reservation as contrasted to an individualistic perspective that contemporary Western society brings. Um, but it wasn't sociology. Now we have social psychology, community psychology. We've had different uh, developments within psychology, certainly many specialty developments in the course of my career since the mid 70s. But I still haven't seen Western psychology bridge the gaps with indigenous, what I'm going to call indigenous psychology, and I'm going to term psychology as the study of behavior. I'm going to do it broadly, not just human behavior, but behavior broadly. And there was an assumption from the outset that that this is the science of behavior. Now, interestingly enough, when I was first licensed as a psychologist, the two major perspectives on the study of behavior came from folks who are well published and at very prestigious universities. I'd say B.F. Skinner out of Harvard, but at the same time that Skinner was there, you had Erickson's, you had Allport's, you had Maslow over at Brandeis University nearby. You had numerous what we would call humanistic psychologists. We had Carl Rogers, University of Wisconsin, later in La Jolla at the Center for the Studies of the Person. So we had two strong forces that were at odds with each other. One was, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. They would call it the ghost in the machine, which was pure behaviorism and Skinnerian psychology. And so I was, as an undergraduate, I did lots and lots of research with pigeons and rats, got to know them well. We would shape them with food, primarily with hunger. We would find a base weight and then reduce their base weight by reducing their food supply until they were at 80% of whatever their original weight was. And then we would use food as a reinforcer to shape behavior. And we could shape all types of behavior, chain it, some really complex. I worked with some very intelligent rats and some very intelligent pigeons and some others, and not so much. And so we had a bell-shaped curve we'd find. But what was interesting was over time, all of my pigeons and all of my rats would quit responding to whatever type of reinforcer we would use and just behave like pigeons and rats again. I bring that up because much of the science of behavior uh, in the 60s and 70s, early 80s, now this has morphed over this time to what we call cognitive behavior therapy and other forms, dialectical behavioral therapy, other forms of treating, quote, mental illness. And I do put that as quotes because the perspective is to some extent medicalized, and the goal was always to reach a standard of the physics of science, of hard science. Our goal was to present behavioral health as hard science. Has it ever achieved that or reached that? In some areas, in neuropsychology, psychopharmacology, in some areas, we've certainly achieved standards of scientific, rigorous scientific endeavor, of things that would be true of any organism, and certainly mammals, mammalians, and certainly humans across cultures and continents. But in other areas, we've had to be reductionistic and identify things that maybe aren't even so. Uh, and where I'm going with this as an indigenous psychologist today is I would translate as a student, undergraduate and graduate, and for many, many decades as a practicing psychology, I would translate what would work within the Northern Plains communities in which I served and where I continue to serve, and you might say the dominant society where I was trained. And I would translate what would fly and what wouldn't fly, and how would it work and why it wouldn't work. because a difference is just in paradigm and certainly in language too. We have Marcita Eaglebear on the line, who's a fluent Lakota speaker. Um, just in the language itself, there's a change in how we view the world. For example, we medicalize in dominant society psychology. We medicalize and pathologize, looking for sickness, looking for problems within the individual, and and uh, and so if we're going to treat a quote a sick individual, we're going to bring the focus of treatment back to the level of the individual. Within the Northern Plains Native communities, of which I've just served three now, with any type of extended practice, um, a focus is not necessarily on the sickness of an individual. The focus should be on the balance and the harmony, and not necessarily of the individual, but for the community. And and not just the community of human beings, but a broader community. In the Lakota, anytime we'll have a formal prayer, we will close the prayer with Mataku Ayasin, which roughly translated, and Marcita, feel free to type any corrections to my my poor language skills, but would be all my relations. The concept is that everything is interconnected to everything, and so the balance and harmony is essential, not just within the person, so not just an ill individual, but within the community, and not just within the community, but within the ecosystem more broadly, and not just within the scene ecosystem, but also many years ago, my father had a stroke, and I was praying for him and concerned about his well-being. And indeed, it was the beginning of his long goodbye to us. And my father loved trees, and why I don't know. And he loved automobiles and trucks and mechanical things, maybe more than people. Maybe material things were easier for him to interact with and to repair and to fix than relationships within our own family. But I was contemplating a tree under which I was sitting as I was praying for my father's well-being and concerned about his future and his current health. And I remember being struck again with the importance not of the tree that I could see, but the tree that was underground, which my father certainly knew a lot more about than I did. He could tell you the Latin word for any type of tree or shrub or bush. Where he learned all that, I don't know. We didn't have Google in those days, but he took it upon himself to learn a lot about trees, and I absolutely enjoyed going to, for example, the redwoods and whatnot in California with him, and hearing his explanation of their hundreds of years of life, and of how the seeds could germinate, among other ways, just through fire. The importance of fire to germinate the next generation of redwoods, and taking that sometimes as a metaphor and an allegory for our life, of how maybe there might be some things that could only be triggered through difficult times, through hard times, through fire. I was going to open with a song, but chose not to, because I don't know so many of the. Hi, Beth, and others, Tammy, Steve, Marcita, others that are on the call and on the video, uh, because I want to be respectful with the diverse and divergent perspectives we have. But within the Northern Plains, our concept of health, our concept of life, our chosen, our concept of is much more than just the absence of sickness. And what is it we can do as a people, as a collective, but not just as a people? But what can we do as a system in order to improve conditions for people who live? For example, we've had unfortunately, since I began consulting here at Fort Belknap, here in the north central Montana near the Canadian border, um, we've had a cluster of suicides, which has touched everyone deeply. This was not intended when I first signed up to work. We didn't know that this was going to occur prior to our developing a tribal integrated behavioral health program. but it nevertheless has occurred. And the responses to it and the approaches to it have included both Western medical as well as the many uh, communities of faith, which would be both Christian and traditional, both Ayani, which would be termed Grovan by many in the country, and the Nakota, which would be termed Assiniboine. Neither name, Grovan or Assiniboine, names that they gave themselves, but names that were assigned them. Marcita, if you can recall, in South Dakota, I used to comment even on the racism of the weathermen, because they would often take the nearest town to the reservation and tell us what the weather would be there, but not identify the capital of each of the Indian nations in South Dakota. Whether that was ever intended or not, I don't know. So I'm delighted to see, while agency isn't listed usually in the weather here in northern Montana, um, uh, sometimes Hayes is listed. Now Hayes is not the agency, not the capital, we might say, of the Grovan and Assiniboine or the Aini and Nakota tribes, but at least it's on the reservation. So at least we're acknowledged as existing here. And in Browning, they would always list Cutbank, which is an off-reservation town that actually adjoins the Cutbank River, which is the eastern boundary of the Blackfeet Reservation. My wife being Amskapi Pekani, which is Blackfeet, and Lakota by heritage. And so we lived there and worked there for many years, my wife also being a clinical psychologist. So I come from a culture that emphasizes, for example, even the power of dreams. And in fact, one of our major ceremonies that sometimes anthropologists reduce it to a coming of age ceremony, which I would disagree with, because I know many indigenous Lakota, Dakota, Nakota people that will continue doing Hambletiapi, going on the hill and praying, seeking a vision throughout their lives. So it's much more than just a coming of age. But literally it would translate crying through the night. To cry for a dream, to dream on behalf of needs and concerns among the community of people, in contrast to going to a laboratory and setting up some conditions and measuring those conditions to find what would be most meaningful to alter the future health of individuals within a community of people. And I bring that up because the thing that would most help the suicide cluster here at Fort Belknap is not probably any psychological interventions. What would help would be political and economic interventions for people to have meaningful employment, for people to have adequate housing. One of our school systems at the Hayes Lodgepole, it's been estimated to me by school board members and school administrators there, that of the kids that finished school there last May and June, approximately 60% of them did not have a home of their own. They were couch surfing as families, going from home to home to home to home, according to the resource of their friends and relatives to absorb them. But during that time, their kids and they themselves were adding to the burden of whoever the landlord was of that particular home. That type of living situation greatly accentuates anything that we would call DSM-5 mental illness. Of the people that I'm privileged to speak with this morning, I'm confident that if I could speak with you long enough individually and in person, I could find a diagnosis for which I could be reimbursed should we have third-party payment. When I first came into psychology, my first class back in 1968, we used the DSM-2, which was under 140 pages. I'm proud to tell you that the fifth edition of the DSM-3 is just a few pages shy of 1,000 pages. So has mental illness exponentially grown in that time? No. Are people who identify all of these diagnostic categories and stuff, are they making things up? No. Are they highly intelligent people attempting to identify uh, clusters of signs and symptoms that together manifest a condition that we can seek in a scientific measure to find treatment for? Sure. But I'm back to what I just said. Rather than bringing in psychologists, social workers, and and therapists, chemical dependency counselors and stuff to address the primary issues here at Fort Belknap. We would, if we had sufficient political resolve and sufficient legislative resolve on the state nationally, locally within the tribe and within the state of Montana, I'm confident we could address the primary issues economically, which would have a huge healing components for our population. Do I think that that contributes to the angst and the pain? One of the things that's happened wherever Western civilization, where we have capitalized the countries, and I'm going to use India and China. When I was in Rosebud 10 years ago, we sustained a rate, as Tammy Clay and Marcita were both very involved with helping us trying to turn that around. We were at a rate of 200 per 100,000 population, which is an extremely high rate. Interestingly enough, since China capitalized to the extent they have over the past 20 years, and India has increasingly capitalized within their country, the nations, for those two nations, their suicide rate has approached 200 per 100,000 population. So along with with an economic system that politicians within two very large countries have attempted to embrace. So we found that using our process, our Western process of money making and of organizing for the sake of monetizing nearly everything, without checks and balances, it leads to very distressed and distraught people. Oh, good, I lost you for a moment. It was just my computer. I didn't touch it soon enough. Why is this important? Because pathologizing individuals is not necessarily going to respond to and fix the larger issues and the core problems and the biggest needs within the community. Another thing that we've done for at least 3 generations, we sent kids off to boarding schools, and Marcita Eaglebear, who's on this call, her and her husband Russell have been very involved with repatriating our kids that were left at Carlisle Indian School, for example, and bringing the bodies back, bringing them back to Oyate, to the Rosebud Sioux Reservation. They're not the only tribe that has sought to do this, but in the course of the 3 generations of as Colonel Pratt, who actually was an advocate and a protector of Indian kids, and kill the Indian, save the child, which was acceptable in those days, that kill the Indian continues to occur, and within the reservations, it's now us killing ourselves, and it's our most precious members, which are our young that are full of potential. For example, if I used an Indigenous health perspective, we're not just concerned about the absence of sickness. Our desire, and Maslow, for all of his influence of the Siksika, my wife's stepmother is from the Siksika Reserve in Canada, and so we've been there many times ourselves with our children to visit their grandmother. And Maslow spent some summers and got his concept, it said, of self-actualization and so forth from the Siksika Skapipakani, from that branch of the Blackfeet Nation. But one thing that he changed it, that made it unrecognizable to some of the people that were his teachers, as far as the Blackfeet concept of actualization, it wasn't self-actualization, it was community actualization. The concept was for community wellness, not individual wellness. And the community always addressed issues broadly within the community when one among them was going amok or having specific problems. They didn't look at it as just a specific person to the problem. And so when we talk about culture as being key to recovery, when we talk about culture being the healer, we're not talking about a ceremony separate from the language, separate from the beliefs and values of the community. And we have several hundred still viable Indigenous cultures here on the lower 48, and also more than 100 in Canada. And so hundreds of Métis and Indigenous Indigenous nations in Canada, and Canada has done more in terms of reconciliation as a focal legislative effort, but the U.S. has done many wonderful things in terms of seeking to um, help us heal, including this program and the sponsor of this program right now. Many years ago, many of us went to Washington, D.C. and attempted to um, get training for Indigenous psychologists and for people who wanted to work among Indigenous people. And it was awesome. We got the support for it, but we didn't get any funding. And it wasn't until Quentin Burdick, the U.S. Senator from North Dakota, died that we were actually able to get funding. And over that time, at the time that I got my doctorate, as best we know, there were still fewer of us that gotten doctorates in clinical or counseling psychology in the U.S. or Canada as of the late 70s. By now, we know of over 400 within the United States that have now gotten their doctorates at one of four educational facilities that focus specifically on Indigenous psychology, though our Indigenous psychology is still looks remarkably like Western psychology with some templates that kind of indigenize the approaches. Why do I bring that up? Two of our champions here in the U.S. is a psychologist who was received his training at Harvard 40, 50 years ago, named Dick Katz, who's been up in Saskatchewan now for over 20 years and been involved at Saskatoon, where he is sought to help develop as a collaborator with Indigenous folks in both chemical dependency and mental health, an Indigenous psychology approach up there. And down here at the lower 48 is also now another Harvard psychologist who happens to hail from this community, the Fort Belknap community, from which I'm talking today, named Dr. Joe Gahn, who's made some very strong efforts to strengthen the validity of indigenized health psychology. And why do I mention even a Buffalo Dreamer? And so Tatanka Wihambly Marcita, our newest grandson's name. So we now have a Buffalo Dreamer within our name. But so we welcome him. We welcome him. We welcome this generation, and we welcome the generation of 7 generations unborn. We welcome them, and we purpose to contribute to a community that when they come, it will indeed be welcoming and a healthy community. And we wish to take from 7 generations that preceded us. So why do I talk about a Buffalo Dreamer? And so I'm going to mention just briefly a Buffalo Dreamer. It was important, usually towards the end of the season, through the course of each year. The Northern Plains tribes would gather in one large gathering towards the end of each year, and they would have the final Sundance, and then they would separate and prepare for the winter. And in the winter, the buffalo and everything broke into smaller and smaller groups, as did the elk, as did the deer, as did everything, to brace itself for winter. Monday, it was 20 below here where I'm speaking from. It went all the way up to 5 below yesterday. Today it's actually 34 degrees. Winter can be quite harsh. Last March was the harshest winter I've experienced in my lifetime. And each time I'd be driving through Rock Box Elder on my way back to the Fort Belknap Reservation, it was 36 below or more every week in March through the end of March. Absolutely fierce. The Buffalo Dreamers had a medicine in which they would plan on the gathering for the following year when they could come together to have their last great hunt and their last community Sundance. And so the Buffalo Dreamer was an important person among the lives of the people. And it wasn't sufficient for them to have a dream that was inspirational. It was important for them to mark a location that they could return to the following year from all the directions that they dispersed to in order to weather the winter and come back together again as one people. And so it's important to have Buffalo Dreamers among us. It's important to have folks among us that still seek that spiritual dimension, because we will not, in the Northern Plains, when we're assessing a person, we're assessing the strengths and the vulnerabilities of a person or a family or a community, we cannot do so without also considering the spirituality of that person. I'm seeing some of the predictions and so forth in the key, and folks are mentioning poverty, which is right up there with any of the ACEs, with any of the adverse childhood experiences, as being a predictor of all types of health disparities. And so poverty is certainly a predictor among the American Indian communities, both urban and rural and reservation on the northern plains, and a disparity that's huge. For example, our deaths are still 20 years younger on comparison than those that live on the reservation, off-reservation communities, the non-Indian people on the off-reservation community. So it's very important for us to take into account. And as I said, is that now a mental health intervention to address the issue of poverty? Yes, of course it is. And not just a mental health, but a lifetime health intervention. Is that a valid concern for people that are making interventions for intervention? Do we have individuals with mental illness? Of course. By dominant society, by any society, we'll find some of our conditions, say such as schizophrenia, have a worldwide incident and a worldwide identification that we could agree with the DSM-5 criteria of signs and symptoms to say that they have this condition. What exactly this condition is still open to a lot of sophisticated and educated guessing, because we're still finding genetic components, genetic elements, we're finding neurochemical components, we're finding neurodevelopmental components, all fascinating and all wonderful. So thankful for all the people that are seeking all of these avenues of mental illness and identifying ways of helping our fellow human beings. But I'm saying at the same time, if we don't address the housing, the employment, if we don't address the protective elements of a thriving, functional community with the legal element, and how can we leave out, all of the use of substances in our explanation, and we say that people are self-medicating, but personally, I think they're doing more than that. One of the things that's long been honored among human beings broadly, hunters and gatherers throughout the world, and I do believe that on the northern plains, the tribes here actually had developed maybe the highest level of sophistication in terms of cultural community, which included wellness. I do not think we would have seen mental illness in the same way that we see it today 300 years ago. My oldest brother used to tell me, quit romanticizing the past, the buffalo are gone, the Trail of Tears, and all those things are a reality. And you don't even know that was how it was. And I don't, but I've dreamed it. And so I believe we had a wonderful world and society. I think it was my European relatives that couldn't handle their own political developments of kingdoms and such that fled. But in fleeing, they brought what they thought was the ideal of their culture with us all the way across that large ocean and relocated. And I'm confident they didn't realize what they were bringing. But they brought, of course, genocide at a level, at a measurable level that's unprecedented throughout the world, as far as we know. The estimates range between 5 to 60 million Indians that died as a direct result of just the diseases that were brought by our European relatives. Right here at Fort Benton, just a few miles south of here, the Nakota Nation, the Assiniboine Nation, estimates were that this particular band that's represented here at Fort Belknap and also next door at Fort Peck, they estimate were 60,000 strong, horsemen, horse culture, Northern Plains horse culture, and dominant in some of the trade routes and whatnot that went through this part of Montana and the western part of North Dakota. At Fort Benton, they introduced smallpox-induced buffalo robes and blankets, and within 6 weeks, they had lost, and again, they estimate over 50,000 members in a period of time of less than 2 months. they sent some of the young people to Canada. Just told them go north, and don't come back. Do not come back. Don't catch this infection. Don't catch this disease. And here in the year 2019, we're still dealing with the effects of that particular smallpox uh, epidemic, which was genocidal with intent and with function. So, if I'm going to talk about the healing of Indigenous people, it's essential to us that it depends on the community spirituality, on the community coming together with the fabric uh, of culture woven into every aspect of that corrective and of that habilitating uh, process towards outcomes. So it's not just a matter of smudging or just a matter of going to a sweat lodge or praying with a pipe, but it's pulling the threads together of, of, of culture and of identity, of which language is a fundamental foundation to that. There's many concepts in Lakota and Nakota that I have to find explanation for in English that that are that address the paradigm of the worldview of the Wolakota. And I bring that up because a real important difference, for example, at the boarding school that I attended, we had a chapel every day and we had Bible study daily and we had church 3 times a week. Uh, we were we were proselytized, I think, in a reasonably healthy way, but we feared eternal damnation. We feared we had concepts that were frightening to young people and maybe old people as well. One of the only clean limericks that I know is there once was a woman named Wild who kept herself quite undefiled by thinking of Jesus, venereal diseases, and the fear of having a child. Well, we had a fear of eternal damnation, and that it was a genuine and real fear. We were taught very clearly that our cultural ways and practices, and even the use of language, was something that would lead to eternal damnation. It cut us off from a right relationship with the Creator through Jesus Christ, His Son. It was a spooky kind of time and a scary kind of time, and I find both the Episcopal and the Catholic and the other churches that have been very active in the Northern Plains in proselytizing us in years past have greatly embraced a good deal of Wolakota by this time and are very comfortable and participant in the ceremonies that we turn to for healings and so forth. What I'm suggesting is that much of what we call mental health and much of what we call psychological science is just as biased in beliefs that do not serve us and do not maybe do not even serve the people that bring them. So I think it's very important for non-natives as well to become acquainted with indigenous worldviews, with indigenous beliefs, with indigenous practices, uh, to to broaden the scope of what we consider interventions. For example, I'm going to go back to the suicide cluster. One of the things that have happened, the many communities of faith that have responded, and we had a similar response in Rosebud. When we realized that part of why our kids don't want to be with us anymore is because we've become so contentious among ourselves. We've become so harsh and critical and gossipy about one another. That a diagnostic category? Not really. When I was young, the old women had the right to address. That was the Supreme Court of the community. And on wash day, when the old women would come together and do the wash, they would speak of people that were aberrant, people that weren't behaving appropriately. Nobody wanted to be the topic of our Supreme Court justices, which was the elder ladies on wash day. The younger ladies could speak and could offer specifics in terms of the aberrant behavior that the elder ladies were speaking of, but they didn't have the right to do uh, gossip itself. And this wasn't done in a gossip way, it was done in a way of concern to help correct the balance of the behavior of some of the younger people within the community. Why do I bring this up? Because now we find with our electronic media, we have kids in middle school and grade school that are creating and sending things that become rumors and become gossip and become bullying that contributes to the miserable condition of our kids who in turn self-medicate with alcohol and methamphetamines and opioids and fentanyl and heroin, all of which we have currently present on the reservation from which I'm speaking today. But I was going to talk about those as something more than just self-medication, because something that the Northern Plains and also non-Indians as well have long valued was altered states in a spiritual experience in pursuit of answers, in pursuit of a spiritual experience. Timothy O'Leary, Kenneth Kesey, folks who in my generation utilized better living through chemistry and altered states that could maybe help us become more sensitive and more spiritually aware and in tune. And so I'm proposing that part of the use of altered states by people, Indian and non-Indian alike, are their efforts to be spiritual beings? Are their efforts to address a spiritual component? And maybe they never knew of how to fast and pray. Maybe they never had an elder who knew how to prepare them to Hamletjiapi, to go up on that hill, to pray and cry through maybe four or even more nights, or maybe a couple of nights, whatever their vow was, in order to seek for help, not for themselves but for the people. And so I'm proposing that current and contemporary, for all of its evidence based and all, the evidence at times is sketchy and is just as belief based as our all of my life I've heard it put down as primitive and barbaric and so forth, and it's anything but. It's extremely sophisticated. It's very well informed. Um, Many of our spiritual and cultural practices here on the Northern Plains uh, are attractive and serve people beyond ourselves, and we have folks that are indeed touched by the practices, ceremonial as well as the belief sets of our folks here in the Northern Plains, including folks like Joe Gunn and Dick Katz, and certainly yours truly right here. Joe Gunn went so far in many of his publications from 2004 on to speak of psychology as a colonizing force itself, as certainly psychology has been present in many of our children. Up to a quarter, maybe even up to a third of our kids were taking from us from the 50s through the Indian Child Welfare Act, which still isn't fully implemented, and we're still having attacks to this day. Uh, People in psychology were a part of that process who would find us unfit parents and find our families unfit to raise a child. And so huge numbers of our children were raised away from us. And many on the phone know of many of our children who, when they got old enough, the court records were sealed, so they weren't able to find their families. But in this day of DNA, they're able to find first degree relatives and find their way back to us, and are hungry to know who their biological families, and hungry to know the stories of their families and the stories of their own particular DNA, their own particular families. Our goal is to provide and develop a healing psychology with a respect for life, a respect for learning, and a true valuation for folks. Well, guys, I've talked a long time. I've just touched a few issues. I would thank you for your attention. Sorry I can't see all of you, but I would like to open it up for whatever questions that you might have. Um, and Steve, I don't know if you were saying something I said was cold or the temperature was cold or both. Hi, Steve. I can see you. So I want to open it up now for any questions or dialogue or comments, because I certainly have many teachers here among us and folks that know far more than me. I have a daughter. I'm so proud. Two of our daughters, one of our daughters has her doctorate in clinical psychology. So she's working with the VA over here at Great Falls. And so I want to do a shout out to Wamadiwi, who I'll embarrass her in case she's on the call. She asked her uncle, "How do you say my name in Indian?" I know that she meant it Blackfeet, but my brother-in-law looked at her puzzled and said, "Gertrude." Her name is in Indian. And our other daughter, who's in Sweden, who has her doctorate in molecular biology, she's a geneticist and is right now working on diabetes, but worked with a team that literally found cures to cancer through gene splicing there at an institute actually at St. Jude's Children's Hospital, moved it over to Sweden to work it there. And I bring that up because they use an approach to health that I think is a broader base, holistic health care that I think is essential for us here in the United States if we're going to address issues that we treat as individualistic things. And I think the epidemiological view certainly has its place and its import, but we need to do both simultaneously. We need to look at the large macroscopic view and the microscopic view simultaneously. So I'm looking for questions here that I can answer while I talk on. But so every year I read a Pulitzer Prize winner that my daughter will give me from the Pulitzer Museum. She'll send me a book from Stockholm, Sweden. And so I read all about Einstein one year. And one of his quotes especially touched me, and it was, "The amount of knowledge that separates myself from an idiot is minuscule compared to all that neither of us will ever know." And I realized I'm going to leave this life still with the curiosity of the second grader that I was many years ago, looking at my younger siblings and thinking how much they still had to learn, how young they were, how vulnerable they were, how important it was that I took care of them. And then third grade, same thing. Fourth grade, same thing. And I find in my seventh decade, same thing. I'm still learning and still have so much more to learn. So I'm open to your questions and comments, folks. So have at it. Do you have any, Katie?
Good question. I've been thinking so much about your talking about your sort of as dreaming about what communities were like before and thinking so much about how Western psychology is focused on the individual and how and yeah, I'm just curious to hear more of your thoughts about sort of having this community mindset that, everyone takes care of each other, that actually like takes a lot of that stress off of the individual psyche. And so yeah, can you elaborate on that? It's
Sure. Well, even with our seriously mentally ill, for example, what we'd call schizophrenia, one of our paradigms with this was that this person had been touched spiritually. And so anytime that you yeah, anytime that you touch spiritually, I'm not Italian, but I'm channeling my inner Italian. Um, Anytime that you're touched spiritually, that you're also altered in our humanity. That part of Wolokota is the concept that all of us are spiritual beings on a physical journey, and part of we're told to, until that bone hardens in the head, we're told to welcome that child because they're not fully human yet. They're still visiting their nagia, their soul, their spirit is still going back and forth between both dimensions of the physical world and the spiritual world. That part of our reason for becoming human is in order to experience not who we are, we're part of a spiritual being, but to experience who we're not, a physical being, separate, an individual separate from Mataku or Yas and from all that exists. We're part of Wakantanka. We're part of all that's creative. We're all perfect expressions. Another effort of a perfect expression. And so when I talk about that, for example, if you're suffering and you come for doctoring, usually we would be most likely to treat you with a chanupa, pipe ceremony, and or an inipi. We would also go into the lodge, the inipi, the home of the Iha, of the stone people. And so we would go into Mother Earth, Grandmother Earth, Unchimaka, with the Tunkashlas in order to pray with you collectively, and you'd be surrounded by other people. Now, you maybe gave tobacco, obagi, to the spiritual leader that was going to pour the water for the sweat lodge, and whatever you shared would stay between you and that person. Not necessarily everyone in there would hear it, or you might just pray silently within the lodge. But it'll be a communal effort to heal, and we'll encourage you to leave the chantishicha, the dark things in your heart, with the grandfathers in the center of the lodge while we're in the womb of our grandmother Earth. It's metaphorical, but it's also literal because we believe that there's little skaskaska, and there's energy that's healing, that's coming through the songs, through the ceremony, through through all parts. To me, that's a wonderful way of seeking wellness within the embrace of folks with no. It's not going to be with condemnation or judgmental. It's going to be prayed with hope. Now, when we say unchika or unchimali, when we talk about being pitiful, now people, or young people, usually mean they're hungover. But that's not what it was to be unchika when I was young. It meant that we had a need, and but there's an answer for it. And we would always seek Tunkashla Wakantan for that answer. We would always seek Creator for that answer. Sometimes people will translate that as the great mystery, and so Albert Whitehead, senior, I always liked your teaching. He said it's mysterious, but it's not a mystery. That's why we hook up to the tree. That's why we go on the hill. Is for us to understand the mystery and to be in touch with and to be in communication with that which is mysterious. And that answers it, Kate, in a circular way. But it's important when you're working with us to realize that we're circular thinkers and circular people. And that's not I think there's great strength in the Hocoka Wakan, in the sacred circle. It's a marvelous shape, and it's a marvelous metaphor for sustaining life.
We've had a couple more comments and questions.
Great.
So I'll ask. Uh, Ann Miller is asking, and it looks like some other people have responded to her in their comments. So thank you for those who have already responded. But I'll ask Dr. Foster to respond. She says, you mentioned psychology as a colonizing force and said it's important to learn and understand what the beliefs and traditions of indigenous communities involve. Do you have advice for non-native practitioners who are involved in these communities and how they might learn in a way that's respectful?
Sure. And I think that's best done. What a marvelous time we have where you can access so much information. And of course, ATTC has so many remarkable resources, both in terms of persons and product that's available. But I think it's best done relationally. And so I'll go back to the circle, and there's questions, for example, about AA and NA, and uh, we had Nanakoa as a marvelous force. Uh, I believe that all of these all of these are useful and inspired and inspirational resources to use within our communities for healing, both native and non-native, um, and whether Christian, non-Christian, certainly westernized, but we're westernized as well. So I don't see it as either or. I see it as this and that, as all having a place in our healing and in our transforming. But one of the concepts, Steve, you asked a question earlier. I think it's very important for our communities to be actualized, not our individuals. What we want is for our communities in each generation to reach the potential. And sometimes the potential, earlier I talked about Wolakota, is you can have no spirituality with physicality. You can have no eternal life without death. You can have no beauty without ugly. You can have no joy without sorrow. You can have no wisdom without ignorance. You cannot have one without the other in this finite life, in this experience that we have of our brief and sometimes all too long human life. And so with our kids, one of the things I tell them, I encourage them. When I talk to them, I'll hold their hand. And that's something else we do. We use our hands. We do hands-on for healing and energy. I know some Christian groups do that. We're taught in psychology not to touch, as if all touch is sexualized. That's crazy. We certainly can touch one another without being sexualized. We certainly can have relationship with each other without exploiting that relationship. So it's very critical for those of us that are in helping professions to take the utmost care that we do not uh, economically, emotionally, spiritually, sexually, in any way exploit the privilege and responsibility of our position as a healer. But I think it's also so I think it's important to find relationship with Indigenous folks in your community. Learn from them, listen to them, pay attention to that GPS that's within you, because it's our belief that that your intention of all the creation, only the human beings can be a part of destiny. We can actually move. We have the opposable thumb. We have this remarkable forebrain. And so we not only can affect destiny and affect the outcome of destiny, but we are participants and have responsibility towards the outcomes of those that we affect through our own lifestyle. So rather than viewing all of life as a monetized resource, to view all of life as a relative, and to view all of life as a responsibility and an obligation to sustain the life of which we are just one expression among trillions. Any other questions? Again, I answered you in a circular way, so hope you folks are tolerant of it, because most of us Indigenous think circular. So if we speak linear, we're doing that as a favor to you. We think and function in a circular manner. And we also played football without a helmet, so that's another
explanation. Steve had asked if you could speak a bit more on the relation between spirituality and recovery and wellness.
And for us, of course, we address, we do things in 4s and 7s, so we have to be numerical as well. Somebody talked about math earlier in a question. And so spirituality is to us is central, it's key, but to us spiritual is that invisible connection to not just finiteness but to infinite as well. And so how can a person recover without that spiritual dimension being addressed, and that spiritual dimension leading? So for us, when the Indians sailed in the harbor, when Columbus sailed in the harbor, that's the joke of what did the Arawak Indians said? They said, "There goes the neighborhood." He couldn't have come into a community more different than the one he came from, because for us, what's not seen is more important than what is seen. In Western culture, everything goes from outward in. Uh, uh, Northern Plains culture, everything goes from spirituality out. And so beliefs matter more than words and actions. And thoughts come from beliefs. And so if people don't work with their beliefs and thoughts, as a child at the boarding school, I considered a lot of the people hypocrites. Now I think differently as an old man. I think it's real important that people aspire to values they can't reach. I think it's real important that they give not just lip service, but life service. But so I didn't pay attention, and over where the ministers would preach, because many of us were sexually abused, we had deep distrust and even hatred. I had even hatred towards my molesters. And so I didn't listen to their teachings, but they had good teachings. And it was Deuteronomy 6:5. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the Beatitudes Christ added, and your neighbor as yourself. As an old man, I completely embrace that Christian message to be the one who loves with all. But to me, that's essentially a spiritual message, Steve, to be the one who loves life with all, with every belief, thought, word, and action, with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so that spirituality is core to any work that we do, our own and the spirituality about us. Also, the spirituality of those who are unborn yet, and those who preceded us by 7 generations, to include them in that prayer. Well, thank you all for your time and attention. Thank you, Kate, for allowing me to present. I hope it touched some of you in a meaningful way. And if you don't mind, I will close with a song, and I'll close with the Thanksgiving song. Tokasela bila maya yelo, bila maya yelo, bila maya yelo. Eh, we chose aniwa maya kucha, bila maya yelo. Tokasela bila maya yelo, bila maya yelo, bila maya yelo. Bichosaniwa maya kucha, bila maya yelo. I'm only going to sing 2 push-ups, but that song just gives thanks. I thank each of you for being on this, but each of you for what you do on behalf of the people. Amataku, yes. See you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Foster. Thank you, and thank you for the wonderful comments and questions and for your interactions today and just being a part of this. And I want to wish everyone blessings in this Native American Heritage Month, and so grateful for you all to be with us today. And hope you have a great day and everyone stay safe and warm wherever you are, I hope. And many thanks to you all. Thank you again, Dr. Foster.
So long until our eyes meet again.